there's a chance that stumbling onto this message wasn't actually an accident. Something, call it timing, call it intuition, call it the quiet hand of God moving in ways that don't always announce themselves, brought a person to this exact moment. And that's not something to brush past lightly. Because here's the thing that most people won't say out loud. The fact that someone is still waiting for their divine spouse doesn't mean they've been forgotten, overlooked, or passed over by God's plan. It means something far more powerful than that. It means they're being prepared for something so specific, so carefully designed, and so profoundly aligned with who they are, that it couldn't be rushed without being ruined. And that truth alone is worth sitting with for a moment before going any further. Now here's where it gets a little controversial. And stay with this, because it matters. The culture has sold a very loud, very convincing lie that if someone hasn't found their person by a certain age, something must be wrong with them. Maybe they're too picky. Maybe they're too broken. Maybe they just weren't meant for that kind of love. And millions of genuinely faithful, beautiful, God-fearing people have internalized that lie so deeply that they've started praying smaller, dreaming quieter, and settling for less than what they were actually called to. But what if the wait wasn't a punishment? What if it was actually the most intentional act of love that God could offer? The gift of being held back from the wrong thing long enough to be truly ready for the right one. That reframe changes everything, and it's the foundation of everything that's about to be shared here. The Bible has never once described the right kind of love as something that has to be chased down, forced into existence, or settled for out of fear. From the very beginning, in the garden, in the stories of the patriarchs, in the poetry of Song of Solomon, the picture of divine partnership has always been one of alignment, of timing, of two people who were chosen for each other long before they ever crossed paths. And the signs that this kind of love is approaching, they're not always dramatic, they're not always obvious, but they are real, they are consistent, and for someone who's paying attention, they are absolutely unmistakable. What's about to be revealed here isn't just theory or wishful thinking. It's a pattern that shows up again and again in the lives of people who were right on the edge of their breakthrough and almost missed it because they didn't know what to look for. Don't be that person. Keep watching, keep reading, because this might just be the answer that's been taking shape long before this moment ever arrived. There's a particular kind of longing that doesn't just live in the mind. It settles deep in the chest, quiet but relentless, like a fire that refuses to go out no matter how many times life tries to smother it. Many people who are walking closely with God find themselves in this exact place, deeply faithful, genuinely grateful for their blessings, and yet carrying this undeniable ache for a partner who truly sees them. It's not desperation, and it's not impatience. It's something far more sacred than that. It's the soul recognizing that it was designed for covenant, for the kind of love that mirrors the relationship between Christ and His church. And that recognition, that holy restlessness, is actually one of the first signs that something significant is already in motion. What's fascinating about this kind of longing is that it tends to intensify right before a breakthrough. The Bible is full of stories where the deepest hunger preceded the greatest provision, where the most sincere cry was met with the most extraordinary answer. So when someone finds themselves praying more earnestly about marriage, dreaming more vividly about a life shared with someone chosen specifically for them, that's not a sign of weakness or lack of faith. That's actually the language of the Spirit signaling alignment. God doesn't place a desire in someone's heart just to leave it unanswered. That's not who He is, and that's not how His promises work. The restlessness isn't random, it's purposeful. What makes this sign so easy to miss is that modern culture has trained people to suppress or dismiss this kind of longing. Society says to be independent, to not need anyone, to focus on self-sufficiency. And while those things have their place, they were never meant to replace the God-given desire for deep, lasting, covenant-based love. A person who feels this persistent pull toward marriage isn't behind, isn't broken, and isn't asking for too much. They're actually in one of the most spiritually sensitive seasons of their life, tuned into something that most people are too distracted to even notice. And if that restlessness sounds familiar, if it's been knocking at the door of the heart lately, then it's worth paying very close attention, because that feeling might be pointing towards something much closer than it appears. There's something quietly remarkable that happens when a person is getting closer to one of the most significant seasons of their life. Their conversations with God start to change. It's not something that's forced or manufactured. It just happens naturally, organically, like a river finding a new course. People who have been walking in faith for a while know what it feels like to pray out of routine, to go through the motions of spirituality without a deep sense of urgency or expectation. But then something shifts. The prayers become more specific, more intimate, more loaded with genuine belief that an answer is not just possible, it's imminent. And that shift, subtle as it might seem on the surface, is actually one of the most powerful indicators that God is actively working behind the scenes on something extraordinary. What's particularly striking about this shift is how it changes the emotional texture of someone's faith. Suddenly, scriptures about love, partnership, and divine timing start jumping off the page in ways they never did before. Passages in the Bible that once felt like background noise become deeply personal, almost like God is underlining specific verses just for them. Proverbs 18:22 hits differently. Genesis 2:18 feels like a direct conversation. The stories of Ruth, Isaac, and Jacob stop being ancient history and start feeling like previews of something that's about to unfold in real time. This isn't coincidence. This is the kind of spiritual attunement that happens when someone is being prepared to receive what they've been chosen to experience. The tricky part is that this shift in prayer can sometimes be mistaken for obsession or anxiety, especially by people who don't understand the difference between spiritual hunger and emotional desperation. But there's a clear distinction between the two. Desperation is rooted in fear. It grasps, it panics, it doubts. Spiritual hunger, on the other hand, is rooted in trust. It leans in, it listens, it expects without demanding. When someone's prayer life starts gravitating consistently and peacefully toward the topic of marriage, toward their future partner, toward the life they feel called to build with someone, that's not a red flag. That's a green light. That's the Spirit bearing witness to something that's already been set in motion, quietly and purposefully, long before it becomes visible to the natural eye. There's a principle woven throughout the Bible that's easy to overlook, but impossible to ignore once a person becomes spiritually aware of it. God speaks through environment. He's not limited to burning bushes and audible voices. He moves through conversations, through a random video that shows up unexpectedly, through a sermon that seems to address the exact question someone has been silently carrying for months. And when someone is on the verge of stepping into a major season of their life, the content and the people that begin showing up around them start to carry a very specific theme. It's almost like the universe, or more accurately, the God who created it, starts curating their surroundings with intention, dropping breadcrumbs that all seem to lead in the same direction. Many people in this season report a sudden and almost unexplainable surge of marriage-related conversations entering their lives. A coworker mentions their own love story out of nowhere. A close friend gets engaged. A podcast episode about covenant relationships plays right when someone needed to hear it most. These moments can feel like coincidences at first glance, but for someone who's walking in genuine spirituality and paying attention to the patterns, they start to feel like something far more deliberate. The Bible makes it clear that God orders the steps of those He's chosen. And if He's ordering someone's steps, then He's also ordering what they see, what they hear, and who He places in their path during pivotal moments of preparation. What's worth noting here is that this kind of divine curation isn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's the quiet nudge to reach out to someone they haven't spoken to in years. Sometimes it's a book about relationships that falls off a shelf, figuratively or literally. Sometimes it's the simple but powerful feeling that a certain person in their circle deserves a second, more intentional look. These moments aren't accidents, and they're not the product of an overactive imagination. They're invitations, gentle, purposeful, God-orchestrated invitations to open the eyes a little wider and trust that the path being illuminated is leading somewhere real. If the content and the conversations around someone keep circling back to love, marriage, and divine partnership, it's time to stop calling it a coincidence and start calling it what it really is: a sign. One of the most surprising signs that a divine spouse is drawing near isn't something that happens externally. It happens on the inside, quietly, and sometimes without a person even fully realizing it at first. There comes a point in the journey where old wounds that once felt permanent start to lose their grip. Past heartbreaks that used to sting at the mention of certain memories begin to feel more like healed scars than open wounds. The bitterness that may have built up after years of disappointment, false starts, and broken promises starts to dissolve. Not because the person forced it away, but because something deeper is doing a genuine work beneath the surface. This kind of unexpected inner healing is one of the clearest signals that God is preparing someone for something they couldn't have handled in a previous version of themselves. The Bible is remarkably consistent on this point. God doesn't bring two people together before they're ready, and readiness almost always involves a season of profound personal restoration. It happened with Joseph before his elevation, with Ruth before her redemption, with David before his throne. The pattern is undeniable. Before the blessing comes the preparation, and the preparation is rarely comfortable. But when someone notices that they're responding differently to situations that used to trigger them, that they're extending forgiveness more freely, that they're approaching the idea of marriage with hope instead of guardedness, that's not just personal growth. That's divine timing at work. That's God smoothing out the rough edges so that when the right person arrives, the relationship has a real foundation to stand on. What makes this sign so easy to dismiss is that healing often feels ordinary from the inside. It doesn't always come with a dramatic moment of revelation or a lightning bolt of clarity. Sometimes it just looks like a random Tuesday where someone realizes they haven't thought about their ex in weeks. Sometimes it's the quiet realization that they actually like who they're becoming. Sometimes it's the ability to sit with themselves in peace and genuinely feel whole, not because they've given up on finding love, but because their spirituality has brought them to a place of completeness that doesn't depend on another person to feel valid. And ironically, that's exactly the kind of wholeness that attracts the person they've been chosen to meet. Healing isn't just a gift for the individual. It's preparation for the partnership that's already on its way. There's a fascinating paradox that shows up in the lives of people who are genuinely close to meeting their divine spouse. The closer they get, the less willing they become to settle for something that doesn't align with what God has placed in their heart. This might seem counterintuitive at first, especially in a culture that constantly tells single people that having high standards is the reason they're still alone. But the truth is almost the exact opposite of that narrative. When someone's spirituality is deepening and their sense of identity in God is solidifying, their vision for the kind of partnership they're called to doesn't get smaller. It gets sharper, more defined, and more anchored in genuine discernment rather than fear-based compromise. And that clarity, far from being an obstacle, is actually one of the strongest indicators that the right person is getting closer. What's important to understand here is the difference between standards rooted in pride and standards rooted in purpose. Someone who refuses to settle isn't necessarily being unrealistic or difficult. They may simply be honoring the vision that God has given them for their marriage. The Bible doesn't paint a picture of covenant love as something mediocre or convenient. It describes it as sacrificial, intentional, deeply chosen, and profoundly purposeful. So when a person finds themselves no longer willing to pour their energy into connections that feel misaligned, no longer entertained by situationships that go nowhere, no longer tempted to force something that clearly wasn't designed to fit, that's not pickiness. That's discernment. And discernment is one of the greatest gifts the Holy Spirit offers to someone who's serious about walking into the right relationship. There's also something deeply telling about the emotional peace that accompanies this kind of clarity. People in this season often describe a calm confidence that they haven't felt before, a settled assurance that they know what they're looking for, they know what they bring to the table, and they're no longer willing to negotiate on the things that matter most. They're not bitter, they're not closed off, and they're certainly not giving up on love, quite the opposite. They're more open than ever, but open in a directed, intentional way that honors both themselves and the person they're waiting for. That kind of grounded expectation is magnetic, and it tends to attract exactly the kind of energy it puts out. When someone's standards stop being a source of anxiety and start feeling like a compass, it's worth paying attention, because a compass only becomes useful when the destination is real and within reach. There's a particular kind of peace that doesn't make sense by the world's standards, the kind that shows up not when everything is figured out, but precisely when it isn't. It's the peace that the Bible describes in Philippians 4:7 as surpassing all understanding, the kind that guards the heart and mind in ways that logic simply can't explain. And one of the most remarkable signs that a divine spouse is undeniably close is when someone begins to experience this exact kind of peace about their love life. Not because they've stopped caring, not because they've given up hope, but because something deep in their spirit has quietly settled into a place of genuine trust. It's as if the soul already knows something the mind hasn't fully caught up to yet, and that knowing produces a stillness that's unlike anything a person can manufacture on their own. What makes this peace so distinctive is how different it feels from resignation or indifference. There are people who appear calm about their relationship status simply because they've emotionally checked out, because disappointment has numbed them into a kind of quiet surrender. But that's not what this sign looks like at all. This is an active, alive, expectant peace. The kind that wakes up in the morning with a quiet smile, the kind that can attend a wedding and genuinely celebrate without a trace of envy, the kind that looks at the future and sees possibility instead of uncertainty. It's a peace that coexists beautifully with desire, that holds on to hope without gripping it so tightly that it suffocates. And for someone who has spent years carrying anxiety about whether marriage would ever happen for them, This shift in their inner climate is nothing short of miraculous. Spirituality has a way of bringing people to this place when they've done the work, walked through the healing, and chosen faith over fear consistently enough that trust becomes their default posture. And it's in that posture, relaxed, open, and genuinely surrendered to God's timing, that the most extraordinary things tend to happen. The Bible is full of moments where the breakthrough came right after someone finally let go of the need to control the outcome. It was in the waiting that Ruth found Boaz. It was in the surrender that Sarah received her promise. The pattern is ancient and reliable, and it still holds true today. When someone finds themselves wrapped in an unexplainable peace about their future, when the panic has quieted and a deep knowing has taken its place, they shouldn't dismiss it as complacency. They should recognize it as one of the clearest signs yet that what they've been praying for is not just possible, it's already on its way.